Disclaimer: this is a fictional dramatization created for artistic, emotional, and educational storytelling purposes. All characters and events are entirely fictional and created using AI tools. No impersonation, misrepresentation, or harm is intended. The content contains scenes of danger involving child characters. However, no real persons or minors were involved in its production. Grace's Love Stories produces scripted, AI-generated stories that promote, entertain, inspire kindness, and emotional connection. We respect our viewers and strictly adhere to YouTube's policies.
The cold seeped through the rips in my tunic, a phantom touch against skin, already screaming with a dozen cuts and bruises. Dawn's light was a pale, watery thing, filtering through the iron-gray clouds to illuminate the ring of wolves that surrounded me. Their breath plumed in the frigid morning air, a visible sign of the hostility that rolled off them in waves. I stood in the center of the clearing, a lone Omega, bloodied and trembling with exhaustion, my survival a thing of disbelief. My own scent was a wretched mix of copper, sweat, and the cloying smell of fear. But I was alive. I had met the Alpha's deadly bargain. He stood apart from his pack, a monolith of contained violence, Roderick Vadron. His silver eyes, the color of a winter storm, were fixed on me, and the air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the night I had just endured. It was something new, something raw and terrifyingly immediate. I felt his gaze not as a look, but as a physical weight pressing down on me, stealing the thin air from my lungs. The forest had tested me with fang and shadow, but the stillness of its alpha was a far greater threat. His wolf was a living storm just beneath his skin, and for the first time since he dragged me from the woods, it wasn't looking at me like prey. The silence stretched, thin and sharp as a razor's edge, and I knew my true trial had only just begun. A wolf to his right, broad-shouldered and scarred across the muzzle, took a hesitant step forward. His voice was a low rasp of gravel. "Alpha, the intruder survived. As per your bargain, she is free to go." The words hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into a churning sea. Free to go. The thought was so exquisitely painful in its possibility that it made my knees weak. I had walked into his forest expecting to be torn apart, to have my bones scattered beneath the ancient pines. I had fought, I had bled, and I had earned my life. But Roderick didn't move. He didn't even blink. The only acknowledgement of his beta's words was the subtle tightening of his jaw. The scent that came from him changed, the cold, clean aroma of pine and frost deepening into something richer, darker, ozone before a lightning strike, musk and possessive, burning rage. It wasn't directed at his beta, it was directed at the very idea of my leaving. "No," he said. The word was not a shout. It was a low, guttural declaration that vibrated through the damp earth and up into the soles of my worn boots. It was an absolute finality, a slammed door in the face of hope. The pack stirred, a collective ripple of confusion and unease. Growls rumbled in their chests, aimed at me, the anomaly who had somehow broken the unwritten laws of their territory. But the bargain. The beta Kyle pressed, his own confusion warring with his deference. Roderick finally moved. He didn't look at Kyle. His silver gaze remained locked on me, pinning me in place. Each step he took toward me was deliberate, powerful, the ground seeming to tremble beneath his feet. The pack parted before him, a silent, reverent wave. He was their god, their terror, their center of gravity, and he was moving toward me. My own wolf, a creature I had starved and silenced for years to survive. As a wandering Omega was stirring in the depths of my soul, it whimpered, not in fear, but in a strange, agonizing recognition. It saw the predator approaching, but instead of screaming at me to run, it wanted to bare its throat in submission. It recognized its other half, mate. The thought was a venomous whisper in my mind, a horrifying truth that explained the feral intensity in his eyes, the possessive claim in his scent. The bargain had been for my life, but fate had played a crueler trick. Surviving his territory had somehow forged a bond between us, a sacred, primal connection that he, an alpha of iron and blood, could not ignore. He stopped directly in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. It was a furnace against the morning's chill. I had to crane my neck to meet his gaze, and up close, I could see the flecks of black in his silver irises, swirling like ash in a storm. He was immense, a creature of raw power honed to a sharp edge. He lifted a hand and I flinched, my body instinctively preparing for a blow. My life as an Omega had been a long lesson in expecting pain from alphas, but he didn't strike. His calloused fingers brushed against my jaw, his touch surprisingly gentle as he tilted my head to the side, exposing a long, ragged scratch from a branch that had nearly taken my eye. His thumb swept over the wound, and a jolt, hot and electric, shot through me. It wasn't a touch of comfort, it was an assessment, an inventory of damages to something he now considered his property. "The bargain is finished," he growled, his voice a low vibration against my skin. "What was owed has been paid. This," he said, his gaze dropping to my throat, "is something else entirely." A female wolf at the edge of the circle snarled, a sharp, jealous sound that cut through the tension. She had hair the color of midnight and eyes like chips of obsidian. "Alpha, she is nothing, a stray Omega, filthy and weak. Let her go, she stinks of desperation." Roderick's head snapped toward her. He didn't speak, but the sheer force of his glare was a physical blow. The female, Lyra, immediately flattened her ears and lowered her head. A whine of submission caught in her throat. The message was clear. No one questioned him. No one spoke of me that way. He turned his attention back to me, his grip tightening on my jaw, forcing my eyes to his. "Her name," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for refusal. My throat was dry, my tongue thick. "Ophira," I rasped, the name feeling foreign and flimsy in the face of his power. "Ophira," he repeated, the syllables tasting like a vow on his tongue. He released my jaw, and his hand slid down to my arm, his fingers wrapping around my bicep in a grip of iron. "You are coming with me." It was not a request. He began to walk, pulling me along with him as if I weighed nothing. I stumbled, my exhausted legs protesting, but his hold was unforgiving. We moved through the heart of the pack, their eyes following us, 100 pinpricks of resentment, suspicion, and fear. I could smell their thoughts, the bitterness of the she-wolves who had vied for his attention, the confusion of the warriors who didn't understand his mercy, the raw hatred of those who saw me as a contamination. I was a disruption to their brutal, orderly world. He dragged me toward a massive structure of dark timber and gray stone that rose from the earth like a mountain's peak. The pack house. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, built to withstand a siege. There were no welcoming lights, no signs of comfort, only stark, imposing strength. Once inside, the cold was even more profound. The air smelled of wood smoke, wet fur, and something metallic like old blood. The great hall was vast and shadowed, dominated by a cavernous, unlit hearth. Furs were thrown over heavy wooden furniture, and weapons lined the walls, axes, swords, and bows that looked ancient and well-used. This was not a place of peace. It was a warrior's hall, the heart of a predator's den. He didn't stop. He pulled me past the curious, hostile eyes of the few wolves lingering in the hall, up a wide, creaking staircase to the upper floor. The corridor was dark, lit only by thin slits of windows near the ceiling. He stopped before a heavy oak door, banded with iron, and pushed it open, pulling me inside before shutting it with a deafening thud. The sound echoed the slamming of a cage door. I was in his private chambers. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The room was like him, large, Spartan, and utterly masculine. A huge bed, covered in thick black and gray furs, dominated one wall. A weapon rack stood in the corner, holding a formidable-looking broadsword. A fire crackled low in a stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows that danced like ghosts. The scent of him was overwhelming here, ozone, pine, and a deep, musky aroma that was purely alpha. My own wolf was preening, coiling in my gut with a treacherous sense of having come home. I wrenched my arm from his grasp, stumbling back until my shoulders hit the cold stone wall beside the door. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice shaking but laced with the defiance that had kept me alive. The bargain was for my freedom. "You have no right." He turned to face me, his silver eyes catching the firelight, making them glow with an unnerving luminescence. "I have every right," he growled. "The moment you survived the dawn, the moment the bond snapped into place, you became my right. You are my mate." "I am not your anything," I spat, terror and rage making me reckless. "I am an Omega who survived your test. I am a traveler who wants to be on her way. I don't belong to you." In 2 long strides, he crossed the room and slammed his hands against the wall on either side of my head, trapping me. His face was inches from mine, his powerful body caging me in. The raw, primal energy coming off him was suffocating. His wolf was so close to the surface, I could practically see its shadow overlaying his features. "Everything in this territory belongs to me," he whispered, his voice a silken threat. "The trees, the beasts, the wolves, and now you." He leaned in closer, his nose brushing against the curve of my neck. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. He inhaled deeply, a long, possessive drag of my scent. A shudder racked my body, a completely involuntary response of my Omega nature to an alpha's claim. It was humiliating. It was thrilling. I hated it. I hated him. I hated the part of me that leaned into his touch. "You are hurt," he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. He pulled back slightly, his eyes scanning my face, my arms. He saw the filth, the dried blood, the deep exhaustion etched into my very bones. For a flicker of a second, I saw something other than possession in his eyes, a flash of raw, protective fury. Not for me, the person, but for me, the possession. He straightened up and walked over to a small wash basin, pouring water from a pitcher. He grabbed a clean cloth and returned to me, his movements economical and precise. He reached for me and I flinched again. "Be still," he commanded, his voice softening just a fraction, though it was still laced with steel. He took my chin in his hand, his grip firm but not painful, and began to dab at the cut on my cheek with the wet cloth. The sting of the cold water was sharp, but his touch was a confusing counterpoint. His knuckles brushed my skin, and that same electric heat flared to life. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat in the tense silence of the room. I was trapped, being tended to by my captor, my enemy, my mate. The contradictions were tearing me apart. He cleaned the wound with a detached efficiency, but his eyes never left mine. It was an unnervingly intimate act. He was seeing the weakness, the pain I had hidden all night to survive. He was seeing the woman beneath the blood and grime. When he was done, he tossed the bloodied cloth onto a table. The silence returned, thicker than before, charged with the unspoken thing that pulsed between us. He didn't move away. He stayed where he was, caging me against the wall, his scent wrapping around me like a shroud. He lifted his hand again, this time tracing the line of my collarbone, his fingers a whisper of heat on my chilled skin. His gaze was intense, searching as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he had never encountered before. He lowered his head, his lips hovering just beside my ear. "You survived my forest," he growled, his voice a deep thrum that resonated through my bones. "Now you will survive me." His hand moved from my collarbone, his fingers tangling in the collar of my torn tunic. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pulled the fabric aside, exposing the vulnerable, unmarked skin of my neck. My pulse throbbed there, a frantic bird beating its wings against a cage. His thumb came up to trace the exact spot where a mating mark should be, a brand of ownership. The touch was feather-light, but it burned like a hot coal. "This," he growled, the single word a promise and a threat, a declaration that sealed my fate more surely than any lock and key. "This is mine to claim, and everything I claim, I keep." His thumb pressed against the frantic pulse in my neck, a brand of heat and possession. My body was screaming at me to submit, to arch into his touch and accept the crushing finality of his claim. Every instinct I had as an omega, every deep-seated biological command was betraying me. It was a humiliating, soul-deep surrender that my mind fought against with every ounce of will I had left. I was not a prize. I was not his property. I was a survivor. "No," I whispered, the word a ragged, desperate sound. I brought my hands up and shoved against his chest. It was like pushing against a mountain of solid rock. He didn't budge, but the gesture, the pathetic act of defiance, seemed to register in those storm-gray eyes. He watched the struggle in me, the war between my will and my nature, with a cold, analytical curiosity. A low growl rumbled in his chest, not of anger, but of something deeper, more primal. The sound vibrated through his body into my palms, a direct communication from his wolf to mine. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of my ear, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to bite. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the searing pain, the irrevocable bond, but instead, his hot breath ghosted over my skin as he spoke. His voice a low possessive murmur. "I will not mark you while you are covered in the blood and filth of my forest. I will not claim you while you are broken." He pulled back, releasing me so abruptly that I swayed on my feet. The space between us was suddenly a chasm, cold and empty where his heat had been. He looked me over, his gaze sweeping from my tangled, muddy hair to my bare, bruised feet. It wasn't a look of desire. It was one of stark appraisal, as if he were examining a newly acquired weapon that needed to be cleaned and sharpened before it could be properly wielded. "There is a bathing chamber through that door," he said, nodding toward a smaller, unadorned door near the fireplace. "You will make yourself clean. There are clothes. When you are finished, you will come down to the great hall. You will eat." Each sentence was a command, an unbreakable link in a new chain he was forging around me. He expected no argument, and my exhausted body had little to give. He turned and walked to the main door, his presence filling the room even as he prepared to leave it. He paused with his hand on the iron latch, his back still to me. "Do not think of running," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "There is nowhere on this continent you could go where my wolves would not find you. The bargain for your life is over. Now you begin to earn it." He opened the door and was gone, shutting it firmly behind him. The sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place on the other side was the final, crushing note of my imprisonment. I was alone. I slid down the cold stone wall, my legs finally giving out, and buried my face in my hands. A dry, ragged sob tore from my throat, a sound of pure, helpless despair. My wolf whimpered within me, confused by the conflict. It had found its mate, the other half of its soul, an alpha of immense power who could offer safety and strength. But the man was a monster, a captor. Safety in his arms was just a prettier cage. After a long while, the chill of the floorboards seeped into my bones, urging me to move. His orders echoed in my head. Clean, eat, simple commands that felt like the first steps in breaking my will. But the grime and blood felt like a physical representation of my struggle, and the thought of washing it away felt like a surrender. Still, the promise of hot water was an undeniable lure to my aching muscles. Hesitantly, I pushed myself to my feet and crossed to the smaller door. It opened into a stone-walled chamber, steam already rising from a large copper tub in the center. The water had been heated from a clever system of pipes connected to the main fireplace. On a small wooden stool beside it lay a soft-looking linen cloth, a bar of unscented soap, and a pile of neatly folded clothes, a simple tunic of dark gray wool and soft leather leggings. He had prepared this. He had known. The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through me. His foresight was just another tool of control. I stripped off my tattered, foul-smelling rags, letting them fall to the floor in a heap. For a moment, I saw myself in the reflection of the water's surface, a gaunt, wild thing, crisscrossed with scratches, my skin mottled with deep purple bruises. My hair was a matted nest of leaves and twigs. I looked like the creature I had become in his forest. Sinking into the hot water was an agony and an ecstasy. Every cut and scrape burned with a clean fire, but the heat soaked into my weary muscles, undoing the knots of tension and fear that had held me rigid for what felt like an eternity. I washed away the dirt, the dried blood, the scent of the forest floor, and with it, a layer of my hard-won defiance. As the water grew murky, I felt as though I were washing away the Omega who had survived the night, leaving only the woman who was now the Alpha's captive. When I emerged, clean and wrapped in the thick linen, an old woman was standing in the chamber. She hadn't been there before. She had slipped in so silently I hadn't even heard the door open. Her hair was the color of snow, braided down her back, and her face was a road map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and clear. She held a small wooden bowl that smelled of herbs. She gave me a long, unreadable look. "The Alpha sent me. You have wounds that need tending, or they will fester." Her voice was like the rustle of dry leaves, soft but brittle. I clutched the linen tighter around myself, wary. "Who are you?" "My name is Alara. I am the pack's healer." She gestured to the stool. "Sit. This will not take long." There was no warmth in her tone, but no malice either. Only a tired resignation. I did as she asked, and she began to work with quiet efficiency, dabbing a pungent, cooling salve onto my deeper cuts. Her touch was gentle, professional. "He has never done this before," she said, her eyes on a particularly nasty gash on my forearm. "Done what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Taken a prisoner?" A dry, humorless smile touched her lips. "Oh, he has taken prisoners. They do not end up in his chambers. He has never claimed anyone, not in all his years as Alpha. The pack is unsettled. You are a stone thrown into a still, dark pond." "I didn't ask for this," I said, the words tasting bitter. "The bond does not ask," she replied simply. She finished her work and stood up, gathering her things. "The clothes will fit. He had them made for you." My blood ran cold. He hadn't just found them. He'd had them commissioned. How? When? "Be careful in the hall, little mouse," she added, her voice dropping lower. "The she-wolves in this pack have sharp teeth, and they do not like it when another female eats from the Alpha's plate." She left as silently as she had arrived, leaving me with her cryptic warning and the chilling realization of Roderick's possessive foresight. I dressed in the clothes. The wool was soft, the leggings supple. They fit perfectly, clinging to my frame in a way that felt both comfortable and exposing. I was no longer Ophira the Wanderer. I was a woman dressed in the Alpha's colors, living in his den. My stomach growled, a fierce, aching knot. I hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. His order to eat was not just about control, it was a necessity. Steeling myself, I walked to the main chamber door. My hand trembled as I reached for the latch. It was unlocked. He hadn't bolted me in. He had trusted his threat to be enough of a cage. And he was right. The great hall was louder now, filled with the low murmur of conversation and the clatter of wooden plates. A fire roared in the giant hearth, casting a warm, flickering light over the 24 or so wolves gathered at long trestle tables. They were eating, tearing into roasted meat with a predatory hunger. The moment I appeared at the top of the stairs, a hush fell over the room. Every head turned. Every pair of eyes, hostile, curious, calculating, fixed on me. I felt like a deer stepping into a clearing full of wolves, which, I supposed, was exactly what I was. I forced my feet to move, one step after another, down the wide staircase. My heart hammered against my ribs. I could feel their collective gaze stripping me bare, judging me. I could smell their scents, the sharp, acrid tang of suspicion, the bitter aroma of jealousy. Alara's warning echoed in my ears. I kept my chin high, my eyes fixed on the empty space at the head of the main table, the Alpha's seat. Beside it was another, smaller chair, also empty. As I reached the bottom step, a figure blocked my path. It was Lyra. the obsidian-eyed female from the clearing. Her lips were curled into a sneer, and 2 other she-wolves flanked her, their postures aggressive. "Well, well," Lyra purred, her voice dripping with venom. She circled me slowly, her eyes raking over my clean clothes. "Look what crawled out of the alpha's bed. He washed you up nicely. Does the little Omega slut clean up well for her new master?" Her crony snickered. A low growl rumbled in my chest, a sound of pure instinct that surprised even me. My wolf would not be called a slut. "I am not his anything," I said, my voice low and shaking with rage. "And I am not your concern." Lyra laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, you are my concern. You are every she-wolf's concern. For years we have fought to be worthy of standing by the alpha. We have bled for this pack, trained to be strong, to be his equal, and he chooses you? A nameless, skinny stray who smells of nothing but desperation and weakness. You are a disgrace to him." She stepped closer, invading my space, her scent a wave of pure aggression. It was a dominance challenge, clear and simple. She expected me to lower my eyes, to cower. Part of me, the part that had survived for years, impressed by being invisible, screamed at me to do just that. But another part, the part that had faced down the shadows in Roderick's forest and lived, refused. I met her gaze and held it. "I survived his trial," I said, my voice gaining a sliver of strength. "That is more than you can say." Her eyes flashed with fury, her hand shot out, grabbing a handful of my tunic, and she shoved me backward. I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of a table. The hall was dead silent, everyone watching the confrontation. "You survived because he let you," she spat, her face contorted with rage. "He saw a new toy to play with. You are nothing but a warm body, a distraction. Once he is done with you, he will break you and throw you to the rest of us, and we will enjoy picking the meat from your bones." She raised her hand, her claws lengthening, ready to strike my face. I braced myself, my own hands clenching into useless fists. This was it. I had survived the forest only to be torn apart by the pack. A blur of motion, a sound like a thunderclap. Roderick was there. He had moved from the shadowed entrance of the hall with a speed that was not human. One moment Lyra was about to strike me, the next she was flying through the air, tossed aside like a rag doll by a single brutal backhand from her alpha. She crashed into a wooden pillar with a sickening crunch and crumpled to the floor, whimpering. The hall erupted in a collective gasp. No one moved. Roderick stood over me, his body a shield, his silver eyes blazing with a rage so cold it burned. He didn't look at me. His furious gaze was fixed on the fallen Lyra. "You dare," he snarled, his voice a low, lethal vibration that shook the very timbers of the hall. He strode over to where she lay and hauled her to her feet by her hair, her whimpers turning into a cry of pain. "Alpha, She provoked," Lyra stammered, terror in her eyes. "She is mine," Roderick cut her off, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that carried to every corner of the silent room. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping over every wolf present. His eyes were no longer silver. They were the solid, glowing black of his wolf. "Let me be clear, she is under my protection. Her scent is now my scent. Her life is now my life. Anyone who touches her, anyone who threatens her, anyone who so much as looks at her with disrespect, will answer to me, and my answer will be your last." He released Lyra, shoving her away. She scrambled back, crab-walking in her haste to get away from him, her face a mask of shame and fear. Roderick turned back to me. The fury in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second as he took in my trembling form. He held out his hand. It was not a request. It was a command. After a heartbeat of hesitation, I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, his grip firm, possessive, and shockingly warm. He pulled me to his side, leading me through the stunned, silent pack to the head table. He seated me in the chair beside his own, a place of honor no one had ever occupied. He sat and the spell was broken. The pack began to move again, but the atmosphere had changed. The air was thick with resentment and fear. I was no longer just an intruder. I was a symbol. I was the alpha's mate, declared and protected. And in that moment, staring out at the sea of hostile faces, I had never felt more like a prisoner or more in danger in my entire life. The silence in the great hall was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from fear and resentment that smothered the crackle of the fire. I sat beside Roderick, my hands still enclosed in his, the warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the ice in my veins. Every eye in the room was on us, 100 tiny daggers of animosity. I was the foreign body, the invading sickness, and he had just declared me the new heart of the pack. They would sooner cut me out than accept me. A platter of roasted boar, glistening with fat and herbs, was placed on the table before him. The smell was intoxicating, a rich, savory aroma that made my empty stomach clench with a pain that was almost nauseating. For years, I had survived on scraps, on what I could forage or steal, my hunger a constant, gnawing companion. Now, faced with a feast, I felt a knot of pride and shame tighten in my throat. To accept his food was to accept his claim, to acknowledge my dependence. Roderick released my hand, but the heat of his touch lingered. He took the carving knife and fork, his movements precise and powerful, and sliced a thick, perfect piece of meat from the roast. The pack watched, their own hunger held in check. The alpha always ate first, but he didn't lift the slice to his own plate. Instead, he placed it on the clean wooden trencher in front of me. A collective intake of breath hissed through the room. A few low, instantly suppressed growls rumbled from the wolves nearest us. The beta Kyle, who sat opposite, stared at the meat on my plate as if it were a lit fuse. In pack law, this was an unheard-of declaration. The alpha provides for his mate before himself. He had not just claimed me with words. He was now cementing my position with the most fundamental ritual of their society. "Eat," he commanded. His voice a low rumble meant only for me, though every wolf in the hall heard it. My hands trembled as I picked up the knife. I felt their hatred, their jealousy, their disgust. They saw a weak omega being elevated above them, loyal pack members who had bled for their alpha. They didn't see the nights spent freezing in the rain, the terror of being hunted, the endless soul-crushing loneliness of being an outcast. They saw only what he had given me, not what I had endured to be here. I cut a small piece of the meat and raised it to my lips. It was tender, rich, and utterly delicious. The taste exploded on my tongue, and my body, starved for so long, reacted with a tremor of pure animal relief. I forced myself to eat slowly, deliberately, not showing the desperate hunger that clawed at my insides. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me devour it like a feral stray. With every bite, I felt Roderick's gaze on me, an intense, possessive scrutiny. He did not eat until I had finished the entire portion, a silent, powerful demonstration that left no room for misinterpretation. After the meal, as wolves began to disperse into the shadows of the hall, their whispers following me like ghosts, Roderick stood. He took my arm, his grip firm. "Come." He led me not up the stairs to his chambers, but through a side door and out onto a wide stone balcony that overlooked the valley. The night air was bitingly cold, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. A full moon, pale and enormous, hung in the inky sky, bathing the world in an ethereal silver light. The forest below was a sea of blackness, a vast breathing entity that held the secrets of the night I had survived. We stood in silence for a long moment, the wind whipping strands of my still damp hair across my face. Away from the suffocating judgment of the pack, the tension between us shifted, becoming something more personal, more potent. "Why?" I finally asked, my voice thin against the wind. "Why did you do that? In the hall, you didn't just protect me, you humiliated her. You created an enemy for me." He turned to look at me, his profile carved from granite in the moonlight. "I created nothing. The enmity was already there. I simply exposed it and crushed it before it could grow. By making me a bigger target," I shot back, a surge of anger giving me courage. They hate me now, every single one of them. They fear you, he corrected, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, because they fear me. It is the only protection that will work in this pack. My protection. I don't want your protection. The words burst out of me, raw and painful. I want the freedom I earned. I survived your test. I held up my end of the bargain. And I told you that bargain is finished, he growled, stepping closer. The heat of his body was a welcome shield against the cold, a fact that infuriated me. What exists between us now is not a bargain. It is a bond. It is the law of our nature, a law older than any alpha's decree. Did you not feel it when you saw me? Does your wolf not call to mine? I couldn't deny it. I could lie to him, but I couldn't lie to myself. My wolf was a coiled, yearning thing in my soul, drawn to him with a force that defied logic and reason. My wolf is not me, I whispered, turning my face away from his intense gaze, looking out at the dark woods. I have controlled it my whole life to survive. I will not let it rule me now. You survived as an Omega by making yourself small, by silencing the very thing that makes you strong, he said, his voice surprisingly soft, though still edged with steel. He was standing behind me now, so close I could feel his chest against my back. He did not touch me, but his presence was an overwhelming weight. You think that is control? That is starvation. I saw you in the woods. I watched you. You did not survive by being small. You survived because when the shadows came for you, you found your teeth. My breath hitched. He had watched me the entire night. He had been a ghost in the trees, a silent observer to my desperate struggle. The thought was both terrifying and strangely validating. He had not just found me alive at dawn, he had witnessed my victory. What was in there? I asked, my voice barely audible. It wasn't just your wolves hunting me. There was something else. Something... I remembered the fleeting glimpse of eyes that glowed not gold or green, but a sickly, pale white. The feeling of being watched by something that had no physical form. A cold dread that had nothing to do with tooth and claw. A deep sigh escaped him, a sound of profound weariness that seemed at odds with his iron persona. It was the first crack I had seen in his armor. There are echoes in that forest, Ophira, he murmured, his breath stirring my hair. Grudges of the earth, things that were here long before my ancestors claimed this land. They hunger, they remember. The trial is not just to survive the pack's hunters. It is to survive the wood itself. Few do. Is that why your rule is so harsh? Why your pack is so brutal? I asked, turning my head to look at him over my shoulder. Because you live on the edge of a cursed wood? His silver eyes met mine, and in their depths, I saw a flicker of something ancient and sorrowful. We are products of our territory. To be soft here is to be devoured, not just by what is in the forest, but by rival packs who wish to claim our strength. He paused, his gaze dropping to my neck, to the place his mark would be. I will not have a weak mate. Your survival proved you are not weak, but the pack does not see that yet. They see only an intruder. I will teach them to see a Luna. The word hung in the air between us. Luna, the female equivalent of an alpha, a queen. It was a role so far beyond my comprehension, so contrary to my entire existence as a wandering, invisible Omega, that I couldn't even process it. Before I could form a response, the door to the balcony opened. Alara, the old healer, stood there, a small ceramic cup in her hand. Alpha, she said, her head bowed slightly. I have brought a sleeping draught for the girl. She needs a dreamless sleep to heal properly. Roderick gave a curt nod. Alara shuffled forward and handed the cup to me. It was warm and smelled of chamomile and something else, something earthy and calming. Thank you, I said quietly. Alara looked from me to Roderick, her old eyes sharp and knowing. The moon is high, she said, her gaze drifting toward the forest. The whispers will be strong tonight. Best to be behind stone walls, Alpha. It was a statement, but it felt like a warning. She bowed again and retreated, leaving us alone once more. The moment of near vulnerability was gone. Roderick was once again the unreadable, formidable alpha. "Go inside," he commanded. "Get some rest. You are safe in my chambers." Safe. The word was a bitter irony. I was safe from his pack, perhaps, but I was a prisoner in his rooms, a captive of his bond. I turned without another word and went inside, leaving him alone on the balcony, a solitary king watching over his dark and haunted kingdom. I drank the draught, the warm herbal liquid immediately spreading a soothing calm through my limbs. The bed was an enormous expanse of soft furs, a luxury I had only ever dreamed of. It was foolish, but I crawled onto the side farthest from the door, as if the distance could protect me. The furs smelled of him, pine, ozone, and that unique masculine scent that was purely Roderick. My wolf, soothed by the scent and the draught, uncurled in my soul, sighing with a contentment that I refused to feel. This was not a home. This was a cage, no matter how comfortable. My eyelids grew heavy. The exhaustion of the past 48 hours washed over me in a final, crushing wave. I was drifting on the edge of consciousness, the sounds of the pack house fading into a dull murmur. My last coherent thought was of the irony of my situation. I had won a death sentence bargain, only to be caught in a bond I couldn't escape, surrounded by enemies and protected by the one man I should fear the most. Just as sleep claimed me, a sound pierced through the fog in my mind. It was faint, carried on the wind from the direction of the forest, a high, mournful cry that rose and fell with an unnatural cadence. It was not the howl of a wolf. It was something else entirely. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony, of a grief so ancient and profound, it seemed to make the very air grow cold. It was the sound of something utterly broken, echoing from the heart of the cursed wood, and a chilling certainty settled in my bones. Whatever it was, Roderick had heard it before. Sleep was not the dreamless void Alara had promised. It was a shallow gray ocean, and I was dragged from its depths not by a sound, but by a feeling, a cold, sharp agony that was not my own. It lanced through the phantom connection of the mate bond, a shard of ice in my soul. My eyes snapped open. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting the vast chamber in a shroud of deep shadows. The sleeping draught had left my limbs heavy, my mind fuzzy, but the feeling was starkly, terribly clear. It was his pain. He was standing by the tall, narrow window, a black silhouette against the ghostly light of the moon. He was perfectly still, his back to me, staring out at the cursed wood. But it was the stillness of a man enduring something unspeakable, his entire body clenched against a wave of torment. The air in the room was thick with his scent, but it was different now. The clean notes of pine and frost were soured by something else, something I had never smelled on him before. It was the scent of old grief and fresh agony, like ozone and cold iron, the smell of a blade left out in a storm to rust. My own wolf whimpered, a low, mournful sound in the back of my mind. It felt his suffering as its own, a primal, inescapable empathy. It wanted me to go to him, to offer comfort, to press against him and share the burden. My human side screamed in protest. He was my captor, the architect of my imprisonment. His pain was not my concern, but I couldn't ignore it. It was a physical presence in the room, a hook in my gut that pulled tighter with every ragged breath he didn't take. I sat up slowly, the furs pooling around my waist. The floorboards were freezing beneath my bare feet as I stood. "What is it?" I asked, my voice a rough whisper in the oppressive silence. What was that sound? He didn't turn. For a long moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. His shoulders were rigid, the muscles in his back corded with tension visible even through his dark tunic. "Go back to sleep," he commanded. His voice strained, a raw, grating sound unlike his usual tone of command. "I can't," I said, taking a hesitant step closer. "I can feel it. What you're feeling." That made him move. He turned his head just enough to look at me over his shoulder. In the dim light, his face was a mask of torment. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along its line. His silver eyes were bleached of all color, reflecting the moonlight like chips of ice. They were the eyes of a man staring into his own personal hell. "This is my burden," he snarled, the words low and vicious. "Not yours, you know nothing of it." "Then tell me," I insisted, a strange boldness born from the shared, unwelcome intimacy of his pain. "You've bound me to you, trapped me in this pack, declared me your mate. If your burdens are to be mine, then I have a right to know their name." He turned fully to face me then, and the full force of his anguish hit me. It was a palpable wave of despair, so profound it made my knees weak. It was ancient, a sorrow that felt older than him, a weight he had carried for a lifetime. He stalked toward me, his steps heavy, deliberate. He was a predator, but for the first time, he looked like a wounded one, and a wounded predator is the most dangerous of all. He stopped in front of me, his shadow swallowing me whole. He reached out, not to touch me, but to grab the thick wooden bedpost beside my head, his knuckles white as his fingers dug into the wood. He was using it to anchor himself, to keep from doing… what? Striking me? Collapsing? I couldn't tell. "You have no rights here except those I give you," he whispered, his face inches from mine. His breath was cold, devoid of its usual heat. "You want to know my burden? It is the scream of this forest. It is the debt my bloodline pays. It is a poison that has flowed in the veins of every Vadran alpha for generations. A poison you will never understand." He pushed himself away from the bedpost and strode toward the door, his movements stiff, controlled. "Stay in this room. Do not leave." The command was absolute. He left, shutting the door behind him, but this time I did not hear the bolt slide home. He wasn't locking me in. He was shutting himself out. I stood trembling in the darkness, the echo of his pain still vibrating through me. The poison he spoke of. The debt of his bloodline. It was connected to that horrifying cry from the woods. He wasn't just the ruler of this territory. He was its warden, its prisoner. And now so was I. I did not go back to sleep. I waited until the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the window. Then I dressed. His command to stay in the room was a direct challenge. He could chain me with a bond, but he could not cage my will. I had to know more. I slipped out of the chamber. The pack house was quiet, most of the wolves still asleep. I made my way down to the empty great hall, the dying embers in the hearth offering little warmth. I saw no sign of Roderick. A part of me, the part that still remembered the survival instincts of a lone Omega, was relieved. Another part, the part that was now inexplicably tied to him, felt a pang of something, worry. I found Kyle outside, sharpening a pair of hunting knives on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone was the only sound in the gray morning. He looked up as I approached, his expression wary. The scar on his muzzle twitched. "You are supposed to be in his chambers," he said, his voice a low growl of disapproval. "Your alpha is not here," I replied, keeping my tone even. I would not be intimidated by him. "I need answers, Kyle. And you seem to be the only one in this pack with a mind of his own." He grunted, a sound that could have been agreement or dismissal. He didn't stop his work. The alpha's business is his own. "Last night it became my business," I pressed, stepping closer. "He feels it when that thing in the forest cries out. He feels its pain. And because of this damn bond, I feel his." "What is it?" Kyle paused, his big hand stilling on the knife. He looked toward the forest, his brow furrowed. "It is an old story, a pack curse." "Tell me." He set the knife down and wiped his hands on his leather breeches, a gesture of resignation. "Generations ago, the first Vadran, the one who claimed this valley, made a pact with the wild spirit of the wood. Strength for his pack, a territory no one could conquer, in exchange for a promise. A promise to guard one of its own, a creature of immense power that had been wounded in the old wars between spirits. Vadran was to be its warden, but his son, greedy for more power, tried to capture and harness the creature. He failed. He did not capture it, but he wounded it further, twisting its nature, turning its grief into a maddening poison. The spirit of the wood cursed his bloodline for their betrayal. The warden's promise became the warden's debt. Every alpha since has been bound to the creature, forced to feel its agony, to contain its corrupted power so it does not poison the entire valley. That is the source of our alpha's strength and his torment. A cold dread washed over me. It wasn't just a story, it was real. The cry was the pain of a wounded ancient being, and Roderick was its living vessel. So the trial, the night in the forest, is a test, Kyle finished, his gaze hard. He is looking for a mate strong enough to stand beside him, strong enough to endure the curse's shadow. He has been looking his whole life. Everyone else who survived the woods was strong, but the bond, it never formed. Not until you. The pieces slammed together in my mind, forming a horrifying picture. My survival had not just been about me. It had been his desperate search for an anchor, for someone who could bear the weight of his cursed inheritance. I was not just his mate. I was a potential tool to manage his own damnation. The revelation left a bitter taste in my mouth. I had been so focused on my own survival, on my own cage, that I hadn't seen the bars of his. He was just as trapped as I was, in a prison forged centuries ago. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, my thoughts circling the story of the curse. I saw Roderick only once from a distance, as he directed a training session in the main yard. He moved with his usual lethal grace, but I could now see the tension in his shoulders, the faint shadow of weariness under his eyes. He was hiding his burden behind a mask of iron, and he had been doing it his entire life. An unwilling sliver of empathy wedged its way into my heart, a dangerous, treacherous feeling. He returned to the chambers late that night. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes etched deeper than before. He had a shallow cut on his forearm, beaded with blood from the training. He moved to the wash basin without acknowledging me, his silence a heavy wall between us. I couldn't stand it. I spoke to Kyle, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet. He froze, his back to me. I gave you an order. And I ignored it, I retorted, standing up from the chair where I'd been waiting. Because I'm not one of your pack dogs, Roderick. I am the woman you have shackled yourself to. The curse, the warden's debt. He told me. He turned around slowly, his face a thundercloud of fury. Kyle overstepped his bounds. And you pry into things that will break you. I'm not broken yet, I shot back, stepping toward him until we were only a few feet apart. Is that what I am to you? A solution to your family's problem? Did you see the bond snap into place and think, finally, someone to help carry this weight? You think this is what I wanted, he roared, his control finally shattering. He slammed his fist down on the wooden table, making the water pitcher jump. To feel this bond with a stubborn, defiant stray? To bring someone into this hell? I have spent my life preparing to bear this alone. Your presence here is a complication I never anticipated. Then let me go, I yelled, my own control fraying. Sever the bond. Let me walk away from you and your cursed forest. I can't. The words were torn from him, a sound of pure agony that mirrored the cry from the woods. The fury in his eyes was replaced by a raw, desperate pain. The bond is not a thing that can be unmade. And the curse, it feels the connection. It is quieter now that you are here. Your presence, it soothes the beast. I don't know why, but to let you go would be to unleash a hell on this valley even I cannot control. We stood there breathing heavily in the aftermath of his confession. The terrible truth of our situation laid bare between us. I was his anchor, his living, breathing sedative for a centuries-old wound. My anger deflated, leaving behind a hollow ache. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just the ruthless alpha, but the man underneath, buckling under a weight he had never asked for. My gaze fell to the cut on his arm, still oozing blood. Without thinking, driven by an impulse I didn't understand, I closed the distance between us, He tensed, his body going rigid as I reached for his arm. His skin was hot beneath my fingers. I gently turned his arm over, examining the cut. It was clean, but deep. "This needs to be cleaned," I murmured, my voice soft now. My touch seemed to short-circuit his rage. He stared down at my small hand on his powerful, scarred forearm, his expression unreadable. I looked up and my breath caught. His silver eyes were swirling with a maelstrom of emotions, confusion, pain, and a raw, hungry longing that made the air crackle. He lifted his other hand and brushed his knuckles against my cheek. His touch so light it was barely there. It was a question, a plea, a surrender. And in that moment, as his thumb traced the line of my jaw, the bond between us flared, not with pain or possession, but with a searing, undeniable connection. He leaned down, his forehead coming to rest against mine, and a shudder racked his entire body. "Ophira," he breathed, my name a broken prayer. My hand tightened on his arm, and then it happened. The moment my skin pressed against the edges of his wound, against his blood, the world dissolved. I was ripped from the room, thrown into a chaotic vortex of sensation. I saw a flash of silver eyes, not his, but a woman's, filled with terror. I heard her scream, the very same agonizing cry I'd heard from the woods, but it was a human voice. I smelled the cloying, sweet scent of blood and crushed wild roses, and I felt a searing pain in my own side, as if a spectral blade had been run through me. I gasped, stumbling back, pulling my hand away as if I'd been burned. The vision vanished, leaving me dizzy and shaking. I stared at Roderick, my heart hammering against my ribs, my eyes wide with the horror of what I had seen. He was looking at me, his own face pale. "What is it? What did you see?" I couldn't catch my breath. I could still smell them, the ghost of their scent clinging to the air around me. "Wild roses," I whispered, the words trembling. "I saw a woman and I smelled blood. And wild roses." The color drained from Roderick's face. He looked at me as if I had just spoken the name of a ghost he had spent his entire life trying to forget. The silence in the chamber was absolute, a void that swallowed the crackle of the embers and the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. Roderick stood frozen, a statue of iron and grief, the name of a ghost on my lips. The scent of wild roses, a phantom from my vision, seemed to cling to the air, a sweet, cloying perfume of death and memory. He was not looking at me, but through me, into a past that was suddenly, terrifyingly alive between us. "How?" he finally rasped, the word a shard of glass in his throat. "How do you know that scent?" "I told you, I saw it. I saw her," I said, my voice trembling as the last vestiges of the vision receded, leaving an echoing sorrow. "Silver eyes like yours," she was screaming. His control, that legendary iron will that held his pack and his territory in a chokehold, shattered. He staggered back a step, his hand coming up to press against his temple as if to ward off a physical blow. The agony that rolled off him was no longer the ancient impersonal pain of the curse. It was sharp, personal, a fresh wound torn open. The bond between us lit up like a raw nerve, and his grief poured into me, a black tide of loss so profound it stole my breath. It was the grief of a child who had watched his entire world burn down. "You will not speak of this," he snarled, but the threat was hollow, a shield of words against a memory that had already breached his defenses. "You will not speak her name." "I don't even know her name," I cried, frustration and the overwhelming force of his emotions making me reckless. "But you do. It's her scream you hear from the woods, isn't it? Not some ancient spirit. A woman. Who was she, Roderick?" He turned away from me, his broad back a wall of denial. He braced his hands on the stone mantelpiece above the fire, his head bowed. The muscles in his shoulders and arms were drawn taut as steel cables. He was fighting a war within himself, and he was losing. "She was my mother, Kathba mother," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. So quiet I almost didn't hear them over the whisper of the dying fire. The confession hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. Liana, the Alpha's mate, the Luna who had come before, the woman with silver eyes. Her name was Liana, he continued, his voice rough with unshed tears. And yes, that was her scent. Wild roses, they grew all over the southern face of the valley. It was the only gentle thing in this entire territory. I stood frozen, my anger dissolving into a horrified understanding. The curse, the debt, the pain he felt. It was all tangled up in the loss of his mother. I took a slow, hesitant step toward him. He didn't seem to notice. He was lost, adrift in the past. The curse, it waxes and wanes, he said, his voice a dead monotone, the sound of a man reciting a catechism of his own damnation. On the nights of the full moon, it is at its worst. The creature's pain is a beacon. It draws things to it. Old, hungry things from the wood. And it weakens the Alpha. My father, he was strong, but the curse wore him down over the years. Our rivals, the Blackwood Pack, they knew the legends. They knew the Vadran line had a weakness. He took a deep, shuddering breath. I was a boy, 10 years old. It was a moonlit night, like last night. The cry from the forest was relentless. It had been going on for hours. My father was in the throes of it, locked in the undercroft, fighting to keep control. My mother sent me to my room. She told me to stay there, to bar the door, but I was my father's son. I was not afraid. He let out a dry, humorless laugh that was more like a sob. I was a fool. He finally turned to face me. The moonlight from the window caught the glistening track of a single tear, carving a path through the grime on his cheek. It was the most shocking thing I had ever seen. The Alpha of iron and blood was weeping. The Blackwood wolves attacked, he whispered. They used the chaos of the curse as cover. They swarmed the pack house. Our warriors fought back, but their Alpha, a brute named Marcus, he came for my father. He came for the heart of the pack. My mother, she was a fierce wolf, Ophira. She was not a warrior by training, but she stood between Marcus and the stairs to the undercroft. She stood between him and my father, between him and me. He looked down at his own hands, as if seeing the blood on them. I came out of my room. I had a small hunting knife. I thought I could help. I saw him go for her. I shouted. She turned her head, just for a second, to scream at me to go back. It was all the time he needed. His voice broke. He tore her throat out. And the last thing I remember before Kail's father dragged me away was the smell of her blood mixing with the roses she wore in her hair. The curse. It feeds on that memory. It uses her pain, her scream, and throws it back at me. It is a poison made just for me. Now I understood. The cruelty, the iron rule, the brutal training. It was all a desperate attempt to build a wall so high, so strong, that no one could ever breach it again. He wasn't just ruling his pack. He was trying to armor it against the weakness that had cost him his mother. His entire life had been a reaction to that one horrific moment. The empathy forced on me by the bond was overwhelming. It was no longer a phantom sensation. It was a shared reality. I felt the phantom sting of a boy's tears on my own cheeks, the crushing weight of his guilt in my own chest. My feet moved before my mind caught up. I closed the remaining space between us. He watched me approach, his silver eyes wide and vulnerable, stripped bare of all their defenses. I stopped in front of him, so close our bodies were almost touching. I lifted my hand, not to his face, but to the bleeding cut on his forearm, the wound that had started all of this. He flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. "Don't," he whispered. I ignored him. I gently took his arm, my fingers tracing the line of the gash. "You are bleeding," I said softly. It was a simple fact, a solid present truth, in a room drowning in ghosts. I led him over to the wash basin, and he followed, his movements dazed, compliant. He was no longer the Alpha. He was just Roderick. He was the 10-year-old boy who had failed to save his mother. I took a clean cloth and dipped it in the cool water, my hands steady. He watched my every move as if in a trance. I began to clean the wound. His skin was hot, his muscles tense beneath my touch. As I dabbed away the blood, I spoke, my voice quiet but firm. This was not your fault. You were a child. A ragged breath escaped him. I was her son. You should have obeyed her. I cut him off, my gaze meeting his. You should have stayed in your room, but you were brave and you were foolish. And you were a boy who loved his mother. Her death is not your debt to pay. He stared at me, his eyes searching my face. Looking for, what, pity, revulsion? I offered him none of it. I offered him only the truth. As I finished cleaning the cut, I did not pull away. My fingers lingered on his arm. His skin was a roadmap of older scars, a history of battles won and lost. This new cut was just one more mark among many. But the wounds inside him were the ones that were festering. He lifted his free hand, the one that wasn't bleeding, and cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek, a gesture of profound, aching tenderness that was more intimate than any kiss. He was not the alpha claiming his mate. He was a man, broken and scarred, reaching for the only person in the world who had seen his deepest wound and not looked away. No one, he began, his voice thick with emotion. No one has ever seen this part of me. I have never allowed it. I didn't ask to see it, I whispered. But I will not pretend it isn't there. The bond between us pulsed. A warm, steady glow that was no longer painful or possessive. It was a bridge. A connection forged in shared agony. He leaned his forehead against mine again, just as he had before, but this time it was not a gesture of desperation. It was one of surrender, complete and total surrender. Your ability to see. It is not just the bond, he murmured against my skin. It is something in you, something that can touch the curse itself. Kyle was right. The bond never formed with anyone else, because they were not the key. You are. He pulled back, his eyes holding a new light. The despair was still there, a shadow in the depths, but it was joined by a flicker of something I hadn't seen before, a desperate, dangerous hope. My father spent his life trying to contain the curse. I have spent mine trying to master it. Both of us failed, he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its command. But it was different now, tempered by his vulnerability. Perhaps it was never meant to be contained or mastered. Perhaps it was meant to be healed. He took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine, a silent pact. There is a place, the heart of the wood, an ancient shrine built around the site where the first Vadran betrayed the spirit. No one has gone there in a century. It is said the creature's power is strongest there, that its grief is a physical presence that can drive a wolf mad. He looked at me, his silver eyes locking with mine, and I saw our future laid out before us, a dark, uncertain path into the heart of his pain. You saw the past through my blood, he said, his voice low and intense. I believe you are the only one who can face what lies there, the only one who can hear the curse's true story, and perhaps finally end it. He squeezed my hand, his grip like iron, but it was the grip of a drowning man clinging to his only hope. I will not command you to do this, he said, and I knew he meant it. But I am asking you, stand with me, Ophira. Help me walk into the darkness. His question hung in the charged air between us, a heavier weight than any command he had ever given. Help me walk into the darkness. It was not a choice between freedom and captivity anymore. That was a battle I had already lost. This was a choice between being a passive prisoner of his fate or an active partner in it. To refuse was to leave him chained to his mother's ghost, to leave this entire pack living under the shadow of a curse that bled into its alpha. To accept was to walk willingly into the heart of a nightmare that had broken generations of powerful men. I looked at his face, stripped bare of its iron mask. I saw the 10-year-old boy staring at a horror he could not unsee. I saw the alpha who had built a fortress of cruelty around his own broken heart. And I saw the man, my mate, who was offering me not a command, but the most vulnerable part of himself. My own wolf, which had been silent and watchful, rose up within me, not with submission, but with a fierce, unwavering certainty. Ours, it whispered. Our burden, our fight. Yes, I said, my voice clear and steady in the quiet room. I will. The relief that washed over his face was a physical thing, like a great storm breaking. It was a fleeting expression, quickly replaced by a grim resolve, but I had seen it. I had seen the hope he had dared to let himself feel. Kyle will guard the pack house, he said, his voice once again that of the alpha in command. But the undertone had changed forever. No one is to follow us. Alara will know what is happening. She carries the old knowledge. The rest of the pack, they will only know that their alpha is entering the wood. We left the chambers not as captor and captive, but as two soldiers walking toward a battle line. The pack house was silent and sleeping, a beast of timber and stone holding its breath. Kyle was waiting for us by the main doors, his broad form a bulwark against the night. He looked at Roderick, then at me, and his gaze was a complex mixture of loyalty, deep-seated fear, and a grudging respect he could no longer deny. The moon is at its peak, Alpha, he said, his voice a low rumble. The whispers are already starting. Hold the perimeter, Roderick commanded. Whatever you hear, whatever you feel, you do not enter the forest. Do you understand? I understand, Cal said, though the reluctance in his eyes was plain. He looked at me one last time. Keep him safe, he murmured, a plea from a loyal beta for his king. I simply nodded, the weight of the promise settling on my shoulders. The moment we stepped outside, the air changed. The familiar cold was there, but it was now laced with something else, a palpable malevolence that slithered from the trees. The forest was not merely a collection of wood and shadow tonight. It was awake, and it was hostile. The moonlight, which had been so ethereal and beautiful from the balcony, now seemed sickly and pale, painting the world in shades of bone and ash. Roderick took my hand. His palm was calloused and warm, a solid anchor in a world that was beginning to feel thin and unreal. We walked past the edge of the clearing and into the trees, and the oppressive silence of the cursed woods swallowed us whole. The journey was a descent into madness. The whispers Kyle had spoken of were real. They were not made of wind or rustling leaves, but of pure despair. They coiled around us, slithering into our ears with phantom voices, taunts of failure, echoes of old pains, promises of a quick death. I felt my own past insecurities rising up like bile, the loneliness of the road, the sting of rejection, the constant gnawing fear of being an Omega alone. I looked at Roderick. His jaw was set, his silver eyes fixed forward, but I could feel the tremor in his hand, the agony that was coursing through him via the bond. The whispers were worse for him. They were not just echoes, they were using his memories as weapons. I could feel the phantom slash of claws, the scent of his mother's blood, the crushing guilt. He was walking through his own personal hell, reliving his trauma with every step. Roderick, I said, stopping and forcing him to face me. The whispers swirled around us, growing louder, more insistent. We have to keep moving, he grunted, his voice strained. No. I squeezed his hand, pouring every ounce of my own stubborn will down the link between us. I focused on the memory of my survival, on the feeling of the sun on my face at dawn, on the defiant pride of earning my life. Don't listen to them, listen to me. You are not that boy. You are the alpha of this territory. This is your land. Command it to be silent. His eyes, wild with pain, focused on mine. He saw the strength I was offering him, the anchor I was determined to be. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer that of a man, but of the alpha in his purest form. Be silent, he roared, a sound of absolute primal command that was not just spoken, but unleashed. It was a wave of pure power that blasted through the woods, and for a glorious second, the whispers vanished, ripped away by the force of his will. The forest itself seemed to cringe, to bow before its master. The respite was brief, but it was enough. The whispers returned, but they were fainter now, more distant, their power diminished. He looked at me, a flicker of gratitude in his tormented eyes. "Thank you," he breathed. We continued on, deeper into the forest's decaying heart. The trees grew more gnarled, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for us. The ground became soft and marshy, the air thick with the smell of rot and stagnant water. And underneath it all, another scent began to grow stronger, weaving its way through the decay. The ghostly, impossibly sweet perfume of wild roses. We found it in a small, sunken clearing, a circle of weeping gray stones, half swallowed by the black earth and tangled with thorny, leafless rose vines. This was the shrine. It was not a place of worship, but a place of mourning, a gravestone for a promise broken centuries ago. In the center of the circle, the air shimmered, and the oppressive grief was so thick it felt like wading through water. I could see it now, the source of the curse, not a monster, but a form of coalesced light, pulsing with a pale, sickly glow. It was beautiful and utterly agonizing to behold. The moment we stepped into the stone circle, the full force of the curse hit Roderick. He cried out a raw guttural sound and fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head. The bond between us erupted in a symphony of agony. I felt everything he felt: his mother's death, his father's long suffering, the generations of Vadran Alphas, who had been broken on this very stone. The creature of light flared, and the scream I had heard from his chambers filled my mind. A silent psychic shriek of unending pain. But this time I was ready. I did not recoil. I knelt in front of him, grabbing his face in my hands, forcing his pain-filled eyes to look at me. "Roderick, stay with me. I am here." I remembered the vision. My touch on his blood had been the catalyst, the key. I pulled the small utility knife from the sheath on my belt, the one I'd carried as a wanderer, my only protection. Without hesitating, I sliced a shallow line across my own palm. Blood welled, dark in the moonlight. "It needs a new memory, Tai," I whispered, not to him, but to the weeping stones and the wounded light. "A new debt." I pressed my bleeding palm against his forehead. The world exploded. I was no longer in the clearing. I was standing in this same circle, but it was centuries ago. The stones were new, and the wild roses were in full glorious bloom. A woman with silver eyes, Liana, knelt where I had just knelt. But she was not afraid. She was holding a glowing poultice of herbs, murmuring soft words to the spirit, which pulsed with a gentle, warm light. She wasn't its warden, she was its healer. She was trying to undo the damage of the first Vadrans, to fulfill the original promise. Then the world shifted. Marcus, the Blackwood Alpha, and his wolves crashed into the clearing. They did not come for the pack house first. They came here. They came for the source of the Vadran power. "The legends are true, Marcus," Marcus snarled, his eyes fixed on the spirit. "A pet spirit. We will take it for ourselves." "No!" Liana screamed, standing to shield the creature. "You will destroy it. You will destroy this whole valley." The fight was brutal. Liana was not just a protector. She was a warrior, her claws flashing in the moonlight. But she was outnumbered. As Marcus lunged for the spirit, she threw herself in his path. He struck her down, his claws tearing across her throat. Her blood sprayed across the central stone, and as her life faded, her agony, her terror, and her desperate love for her son and her mate poured into the spirit. The spirit, already wounded, absorbed her dying moments. It twisted, its gentle light turning sickly and pale. It screamed, and its grief became the curse, not a punishment from the forest, but the echo of Aluna's murder, bound to the blood of the man she had died to protect. The vision faded, and I was back on my knees in the dark clearing, my bloody hand still pressed to Roderick's forehead. He was staring at me, his eyes wide with the shared truth. He had seen it all with me. His mother hadn't died because he had distracted her. She had died here, defending the very heart of their power, a hero, not a victim. His entire life, the guilt that had defined him, was a lie. The spirit pulsed, its shriek softening into a low, mournful keen. It was no longer just a well of pain. It was a memory. She wasn't running from him, Roderick whispered, his voice cracking. She was fighting for us. And her story was never told, I finished for him, my own tears mixing with the blood on my hand. The curse isn't a debt to be paid. It's a wound that was never allowed to heal. I looked at the keening light, at the echo of his mother's soul trapped with it. I did not feel fear. I felt a profound, aching pity. I held out my other hand, the one that wasn't bleeding, toward the light. It's over, I said, my voice soft. He knows the truth. You can rest. The light pulsed one last time, a wave of pure, undiluted gratitude and love washing over us. It was Liana's love, and then it simply dissolved. Like smoke on the wind, the pale light faded, leaving behind only the scent of wild roses. The oppressive weight on the forest lifted. The whispers were gone. The air was clean and cold for the first time in a century. Roderick took a breath, a deep, shuddering gasp, and it was the first breath he had ever taken as a free man. The strength left my body, and I sagged forward. He caught me, his arms wrapping around me, pulling me against his chest. He buried his face in my hair, and his body shook with silent, racking sobs. He was not weeping for the boy he had been, but for the mother he had finally been allowed to mourn. We stayed like that for a long time, kneeling on the cold earth in the circle of stones, holding each other as the ghosts of the past finally faded away. When he finally lifted his head, his silver eyes, washed clean of all torment, glowed in the moonlight. He looked at me not as a key, not as an anchor, but as his equal, his other half. You have given me back my past, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion so powerful it was almost reverent. You have given this pack back its future. He gently cupped my face, his thumbs wiping away my tears. I told you that you were mine to claim. I was wrong. It is I who am yours, Ophira, body, soul, and now, for the first time, a heart that is not broken. He leaned in and his lips met mine. The kiss was not one of possession or primal hunger. It was a kiss of profound gratitude, of searing devotion, a promise spoken without words. It was the taste of salvation. He pulled back, his forehead resting against mine, his gaze intense. This is not a claim of ownership, he growled, his voice a low, sacred vow. It is a promise, my life for yours, my strength to be your shield, my soul to be your home, always. Then he lowered his head to the curve of my neck. I tilted my head, not in submission, but in acceptance, in offering. There was a sharp, searing heat as his teeth sank into my flesh, and the world exploded in a flash of silver light. The bond, which had been a chain, then a bridge, now solidified into an unbreakable, eternal foundation. It was not the brand of a captive, but the seal of a queen. The first snows of winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in a pristine, silent shroud of white. From the stone balcony of the Alpha's chambers, the world looked clean, new, and utterly at peace. The cursed wood was no longer a place of dread. It was just a forest, its ancient pines heavy with snow, its shadows holding nothing more menacing than sleeping squirrels and the promise of a long winter's nap. The whispers were gone. The oppressive fear that had clung to this territory for a century had vanished, leaving behind only the crisp, clean scent of pine and ice. A warm, heavy weight settled around my shoulders. I leaned back into the solid wall of Roderick's chest, his arms wrapping around me, pulling the thick fur cloak tighter. He rested his chin on the top of my head, and we stood in comfortable silence, watching the snowflakes drift down like lazy feathers. The mating mark on my neck, long since healed into a swirl of silvery scars, tingled with a familiar warmth, a constant, pleasant hum that was the echo of his soul against mine. "Kael says the stores are full," he murmured, his voice a low rumble against my ear. "Enough to last us through the harshest winter. The pack is strong, content. Content. It was a word I never thought I would associate with the Vadran pack. But the change in them since the breaking of the curse had been nothing short of a miracle. With the constant psychic pressure of the curse lifted from their alpha, the oppressive tension that had kept them all on a knife's edge had evaporated. The brutal, fear-based hierarchy had slowly given way to a structure built on true strength and mutual respect. Lyra, who had once been my most vicious antagonist, was now the head of the pack's hunters. The first few weeks after that night in the forest had been tense. She had avoided me, her shame and resentment a bitter scent whenever I was near. But one day, I had sought her out in the training yard. I didn't offer platitudes or demand an apology. I simply challenged her to a spar. She had looked at me with shock, then a flicker of her old arrogance. She accepted, likely expecting to put the Omega slut in her place once and for all. We fought for nearly an hour. She was stronger, more skilled with the blade. But I was faster, and I had a core of desperate survivor's will that she had never been forced to develop. I did not win, but I did not lose. I earned a split lip and a dozen bruises, and in return, I gave her a dislocated shoulder and a healthy dose of respect. From that day on, something shifted between us. She no longer saw me as a weak stray who had stolen her alpha, but as a Luna who had bled on the same ground she had. "They see you now," Roderick continued, as if reading my thoughts. His hand came up to gently trace the silvery mark on my neck. "Not just as my mate, but as their Luna, the one who brought the sun back to the valley." I smiled, turning in his arms to face him. His silver eyes, once the color of a winter storm, were now clear and bright, the shadows in their depths banished forever. The harsh lines of his face had softened, replaced by a calm strength that was far more powerful than his old iron rule had ever been. He was still a formidable, lethal alpha, but his heart was no longer a fortress. It was a home, and it was mine. "You did that," I corrected him softly, my gloved hand rising to cup his jaw. "You faced your past, you let it go." "I faced it with you," he countered, his voice a low possessive growl that still sent a shiver of pure primal pleasure through me. "You were the one who walked into the darkness with me. You were the one who was not afraid of my scars." He leaned down and captured my lips in a slow, deep kiss that tasted of the cold winter air and the unwavering warmth of his love. It was a kiss of quiet contentment, of a bond that had been forged in trauma and tempered into something unbreakable. Later, we walked down to the great hall. It was no longer a Spartan warrior's hall, filled with shadows and suspicion. Bright tapestries, woven by the pack's women, now hung on the stone walls, their vibrant colors depicting scenes of hunts and festivals. The long trestle tables were filled with wolves laughing and talking, their voices a cheerful murmur instead of a collection of resentful whispers. A group of children chased each other around the roaring central hearth, their delighted shrieks echoing through the rafters. Ilara sat in a chair by the fire, her old face wrinkled into a genuine smile as she watched them. She looked up as we approached, her sharp eyes twinkling. "Luna Alpha." "Ilara," I said, sitting on the hearth beside her. "You look well." "The air is cleaner," she said, her gaze drifting around the lively hall. "It is easier to breathe in this valley now. The old ghosts are at peace." She looked at my hand, which Roderick had taken in his. The first Vadran made a promise to protect the spirit. His son broke it. But you made a new promise. You offered your own blood not to master it, but to heal it. You fulfilled the original bargain. The warden's debt had become the Luna's grace. That evening, as the moon rose, full and brilliant in the clear winter sky, Roderick and I walked into the forest. We wore thick cloaks and snowshoes, our breath pluming in the frigid air. We followed the old path, now covered in a thick blanket of snow, our steps the only sound in the profound, peaceful silence. We came to the circle of weeping stones. They were draped in snow, looking less like gravestones and more like sleeping giants. The oppressive aura was gone, replaced by a feeling of profound tranquility. And in the center of the circle, where the wounded spirit had once pulsed with agony, something new was growing. Pushing up through the snow, defying the frost and the bitter cold, were the thick, thorny stems of a rosebush. And on its branches, nestled amongst the green leaves, were dozens of buds, their petals just beginning to unfurl. They were the color of the pale moonlight, their edges tipped with the faintest blush of pink. The sweet, gentle scent of wild roses filled the clearing, a perfume of memory and rebirth. Roderick knelt, his gloved fingers brushing a snowflake from one of the perfect, impossible blossoms. "Liana's roses," he whispered, his voice thick with reverence. "They are blooming in winter." He stood and pulled me into his arms, holding me tight as we looked at the miracle before us. The curse had not just been a wound, it had been an imbalance, a debt of blood that had poisoned the very land. And with its healing, the land itself was healing, bringing forth life in the dead of winter as a testament to the new balance we had found. I had walked into this territory as a trespasser, a lone omega expecting a death sentence. I had earned my survival through a deadly bargain, only to find myself bound to a tormented, ruthless alpha. I thought I had won my life, but instead I had found it. I had found my pack, my purpose, my home. I had found the other half of my soul. "I love you, Ophira," Roderick murmured into my hair, his voice a sacred vow spoken in the heart of his reborn kingdom. "And I love you, Roderick," I whispered back, my heart full to bursting. We stood there for a long time, two wolves under the winter moon, surrounded by the impossible roses. Our past finally laid to rest, and our future stretching before us, as bright and limitless as the snow-covered valley. The bargain had been for my life, but what I had received was so much more. I was no longer the Alpha's deadly bargain. I was his Luna. I was his love. And I was finally home.